My name is Chris Collier. I'm the Executive Director of the Garden Theater, and I want to thank you all for joining us tonight for this special Film 101 presentation. We made this available just to our Garden Theater members, so I want to thank you all for being members of the theater and supporting us. Your support is even more essential now while we are closed. So thank you so much for your membership. It is the one thing that is keeping us going. And we look forward to the time that we are going to reopen and be able to show movies in person again. But very happy for these opportunities to get together to discuss films until then. The Vesta Fund is our sponsor for this series, and we do have many other Film 101 programs. Two that I wanted to highlight coming up in December. We have a great program of The Thin Man, which will be moderated by Hannah Jack, who's a writer for Turner Classic Movies. And then we have Princeton professor Maria Di Bautista, who will be doing a 2-film series also in December called Libeled Ladies, featuring the film Libeled Lady and the Lady Eve. So that'll be really enjoyable as well. All of these programs are free for members, thanks to the support of the Vesta Fund. So please check those other ones out on our site and sign up. We hope you join us and are part of those conversations. In terms of Zoom etiquette, I'm sure, 8 months into all of this, all of you are familiar with how all of this works, but it doesn't hurt to just reiterate some things. We just request that everyone remain on mute unless speaking. That makes the conversation move smoothly. And when we start with questions and conversation, we'll start with unmuting and asking away. And if we feel that we're stepping on each other's toes or having trouble there, we'll move to a hands up system or to use the chat, and I will help moderate that. So far in all the Film 101 events that we've had, it's gone super smoothly and we haven't had to buckle down on this, and the conversation has rolled along wonderfully, but just thought I'd lay that out there. We are thrilled to have James Steward as our guest host and moderator tonight. He joined the Princeton University Art Museum as its director in April 2009. Since that time, Stewart has launched a number of initiatives to position the museum at the heart of the university experience, including expanding the museum's programs of exhibitions and educational activities, as well as its open hours and outreach efforts. He's a lecturer with the rank of professor in the Department of Art and Archaeology and a faculty fellow of Rockefeller College. And more importantly, he's a regular speaker at the Garden Theater and a wonderful contributor in the programs that we have, and has made sure that our programming remain incredibly artful and provides incredible insight into the films that we have. So with that, I'm very excited to turn things over to James, and I think this film has a lot for us to dig into. So James, take it away.
Thank you, Chris. Well, the first thing I want to say is really how much I enjoy this collaboration. We collaborate with a number of institutions around the region, and this might be my personal favorite. You don't have to admit that to anyone else, but partly because I simply love film. And so having the occasion to gather with some other people who enjoy thinking about film is just, a real treat. And I also want to say I join all of you in being a member of the Garden Theater, and I'm proud to do what little I can to help you, Chris. So as some of you heard me say that to introduce the subject, I'm actually going to screen share to bring up a few still images, not selections or sequences from the film, in part as a way of introducing a few of the themes that are, to me, the most arresting, and also to suggest a little bit about why I chose and wanted to participate in the discussion of this particular film. So I'm going to share my screen. Take me just a second to do that. All right, hopefully you can now see a black screen. So to begin with, something about why I chose this film. I've been fascinated by and perplexed by Terrence Malick's films, really, I think, since I was an undergraduate at university. I'm just showing you a still here from Days of Heaven, his 1978 film, which I think we screened together at some past moment at the Garden Theater. Most of us who came to Malick earlier in his career, I think, have long been kind of captivated by both the sheer visual wonder of his filmmaking, but also the way in which he tries to grapple with fundamentally philosophical issues, which I think are among the reasons, of course, why sometimes his films can be so polarizing. People often love them or hate them. For me, again, the Tree of Life sits in a lineage that's kind of resuscitated with the advent of his kind of second wave of filmmaking in the 21st century. Here just a couple of still images from the New World from 2005. In other words, 6 years, I think, before the Tree of Life, with which I think there are certain kind of strands of similarity, not least even the fact that the final image from the New World sort of presages a couple of, or some very important visual images from Tree of Life.
You want some candy to eat on the way home?
I think we need someone to mute themselves.
All the candy that we bought.
To turn then to the Tree of Life, part of what to me is so extraordinary about this film is that the way in which it functions both textually and visually as an investigation into the very...
Is that just on my computer or is that on anybody else's computer?
Can we mute?
What?
Yeah, I'm trying to do that. Give me 1 second.
Okay.
I mean, you can change what that name appears to be, but
It's on my computer. Everybody sees it?
Everybody sees. Yeah. And you can adjust, you can do this.
Could the folks who are
This way,
talking just for the
that way,
moment mute
this
themselves?
But where's
Zoom in.
everybody else?
Oh, well, so that you would have to view gallery. And
You can hear us. You should mute.
what else is there? Well, looks like they've set it so they have some sort of presentation here, but there's all these people. Scroll down. Zoom is it's the standard. It's not
Lucy
perfect.
or Lucy's companion, could you just mute yourselves for the moment till
I
we get
fixed it
to
now,
the
James.
discussion? Okay. All right. That sounds much better. Thank you. All right. So for interrupting. What I was starting to say was that for me, the Tree of Life is fundamentally about different ways of being in the world. And as an extension of that, the human relationship to something beyond human existence that might be termed the divine. It is a film that operates in multiple modes simultaneously in ways that can be, I think, both pleasing and perplexing. Part of the film that works best for me is the way in which it investigates memory and our relationship with our own past. Very few films leave me with such a powerful sense of the way in which memory works in its momentary glimpses, its kind of non-linear narratives, its impressionistic qualities that don't have a kind of sustained through line. I think what partly makes the Tree of Life so daring is that it captures not just memories, but the feelings aroused by the very act of remembering. In that sense, it becomes a very subjective kind of film. If you've seen the film, and I hope everyone on the call tonight has done so, it's composed around what I will characterize as daily infinitesimal things that surge kind of in and out of time in extraordinary visual detail, captured in shots that are floating and traveling and somehow unmoored in many respects, certainly unmoored by the typical kind of framing devices of cinema. It becomes then a quest for the eternal in the ephemeral, the transcendent in the most banal things of everyday life. The ecstatic in the ordinary, and ultimately, as I've already suggested, the deeply suggestive. In all of this, I think Terrence Malick suggests that there's a kind of grandeur of feeling that's there in the most banal things, that is there for the taking for all of us, that's sort of latent in life itself. He connects all of this with the idea of love, of longing, of tenderness, the realm of feeling an emotion that we all basically have access to in some way or another, with or without some of the key elements of the film, the age of Sputnik, for example, or the importance of classical music. It is obviously a soundtrack that's almost overwhelmed by music. Or as in the film, the open spaces of Texas. I think in all of this, it's very generous as a film. But I don't mean to suggest in saying these things that I have an uncomplicated relationship with this film. I didn't, in fact, want to participate in a discussion of it simply because I might love it unreservedly, because I don't, but rather because I find it's an unusual film for me that changes in the revisiting. My experience of it is perpetually different. For example, in the most recent viewing, when preparing for this program, I was once again struck by certain sequences that for me are just rhapsodically extraordinary. If you remember the sequence with which Malick begins the kind of narrative of the O'Brien family, that the kind of center section of the film, it begins with some of the most balletic, even sort of preternaturally beautiful editing and camera movement that I've ever seen in a narrative film. But by the same token, there are sequences that leave me annoyed, aggravated. There's for me, a kind of new ageism to the final sequence of the film that's much less satisfying. But in all of this, it's a little bit like the things that I also have a desire to revisit in life. I was thinking earlier, for example, of Jane Austen's novels. When I first read Jane Austen, probably at around the age of 18 or 19, I was left substantially unmoved. I think I was simply too young and didn't have enough experience of a sort of adult range of feeling to more fully engage with them. When I came back to them at 30, they meant something wholly different to me. And I think there are ways in which the Tree of Life operates in a somewhat analogous way. So that's my quick kind of introduction. And I'm going to unshare my screen. I have other images I prepared that we might come back to. And so I might put those up from time to time if there's a moment when it makes sense to do that. So Chris, I'll stop talking, and I'm happy to maybe have you, if you want to lead off with a question or a remark or an aspect of the film that you'd like to dig into.
Well, it doesn't necessarily need to be me. I really wanted to ask about why you had selected the film, and you had definitely covered that in your conversation there. So the one thing that I will start with, I mean, obviously, I think this film is very different watching it on a big screen and being immersed in it. And I mean, in watching it this go round, I actually turned on the subtitles. Was actually for the first time able to really understand what some of the people were saying, because Malick does like to break voices from the people speaking them, so words just sort of float. Can you speak to the different ways in which you've experienced the film? I know you were talking about how just how it changed this time, but does watching it on a smaller screen or watching in this context allow you a different vantage point in it? Or and I open it up to other people to ask if this was the first time that people have seen it, or did people see it before on a big screen and get to revisit it? Just sort of thinking about the cosmic size of the film and the format in which we're all talking and how we built this program.
So Chris, I'll offer up a couple of responses to that, and then I'd love to hear thoughts from others. So I've seen it in multiple formats. I have seen it on the truly screen fortunate enough in having a large screen at home, so that it wasn't reduced for me to the to the size of a monitor, for example. But I think it is part of what allows me to respond maybe differently from one viewing to another to different aspects of the film. And it is obviously a film that operates on multiple levels, right? That moves, as I've suggested, I think very intentionally, from the very personal to the cosmic. People regularly say of this film that it's the most autobiographical of Malick's film, which is striking because he's such a private person who seems to want to share very little. It's all but impossible to discover much about him. And yet he reveals certain things, including about his Texas upbringing, the lost brother, some other kind of key elements of the film. Watching it this time, it was that central sequence, the kind of the family, the O'Brien family in Texas, that I most responded to. Whereas I think perhaps because I was watching in a domestic environment, I was somewhat less responsive to the kind of cosmic aspects of the film. I was struck, though, that in this particular viewing, when I teed it up, and I admit I watched it digitally rather than, well, I guess it's all digital, but rather than from a Blu-ray, for example, my screen gave me the advice to turn the sound up. I don't know if anyone else had the experience. There's advice early on before the film begins that says the filmmakers recommend viewing this with the sound very high because it's best experienced that way.
It's pretty good advice.
It is good advice, I think, but it's also surprising advice. I don't recall that I've ever had that advice, in a home viewing moment. And so one of the things I was going to say, Chris, of course, in this case, I took the advice and I turned the volume way up. And, viewing at home allows us to customize our choices, right? As distinct from what we have when we're in a screening room together, where it presumably is the screener's choice of what the volume should be. But I found, that I didn't necessarily want to do that through the whole of the film. There were a couple of sequences, again, kind of early in the O'Brien narrative, that the elements I was referencing a bit, that are, to my mind, such a kind of, again, rhapsodic combination of sound and image, that not only did I want the sound really high and kind of saturated compared to the subsequent sections, which are where in many ways the music kind of goes away. But I was actually so kind of compelled by the experience of it that I was actually, I got my iPhone out and was filming selections of it to share with friends while I was viewing it, which to my, that's very rare for me. I don't do that on a routine basis. So, there is something, I think, in both the magisterial and the intimate that probably is part of what Malick intended.
Would anyone else like to comment on their viewing experience? David, yes.
Hi, I'm David. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I was 10 years old or 11 years old when this movie came out in theaters. So I have not had the pleasure of seeing it in theaters. Actually, the only film of his that I saw in theaters was A Hidden Life. I was interning at the Cannes Film Festival, and so I had the pleasure of seeing it there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah, so I've seen it on a variety of TVs. I've seen it on my laptop, which is actually the first place that I saw it. And when I viewed it on my laptop, I was probably like 15 when I first saw it. So, and I mean, I'm 20 now, so I still don't have the range of emotional experience as a lot of you guys. So, my feelings towards it haven't changed much, but I do appreciate certain aspects of it more so now. I think I've seen it like 4 times. And I've made the mistake of trying to show it to people that I kind of know wouldn't be interested, but I wanted to try to, pleasantly surprise myself. But
did it work?
Yeah, for one.
So you had one convert.
Yeah. Well, 1 out of 2, so 50% success rate. But yeah, I'd say I would love to see it in theaters, but I think that it's such a captivating film for me. And he's probably been the filmmaker that has influenced me the most. I just graduated from film school, so so I have that influence for sure. He also is the one that I would say created my love of voiceovers, and that's I'll open the floor to other people, but he's definitely been one of my most influential filmmakers, just in my life and in like my career as well.
So David, let's come back in a second to the question of the voiceovers, but I am curious if anybody else wants to comment about just the viewing experience, as Chris is putting it. Anyone else on this call who's experienced it more than
Rob?
once?
I've only seen it this one time last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever, I saw this email about it and I was kind of interested. Being a member, I wanted to just, I always love to see all the great things the Princeton Garden Theater puts out. I have to tell you, I watched it with my son, who's 24. He's more of a sports guy and not a film buff. And myself, I'm in the photography world, profession. I don't shoot, but I shoot, but I represent commercial photographers. So and I went to visual arts years ago, so I like to think that, I'm very into the cinematic and the cinematography and the lighting and all that stuff. Everything about that film captivated me, but my son walked out as soon as that cosmic stuff started and couldn't. And I think for me, I wasn't too familiar with Terrence Malick. I seen Thin Red Line and a couple of other, but not to a point where I knew all of his work. And when I first got into the cosmic part, I wasn't sure, I flipped channels by accident somewhere. I was like, and the thing about it was for me that I couldn't not watch this whole film, and not because of this or anything else. I was actually captivated by it, but yet certain parts of it, I felt he dragged through a lot of that. I don't know if that was just, just me and it wasn't as if it was, I just felt like I went from a kind of a family documentary about their lives in Texas to
2001
to a National Geographic. I thought I was on Nat Geo for a minute.
With a little bit of homage. With a little bit of homage to 2001: A Space Oddities thrown in for good measure. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I was fascinated that he was actually able to do that, but I think for me, I was also happy because I think that part of it, again, just personally, just went a little further than it needed to. He took a lot of time, I felt, to float through through the cosmos for me.
So I mentioned earlier that I think this is one of the most divisive films that he has made in terms of how it with the kinds of responses it elicits, right? There are people like me who are able to see, if not the whole, then many of the aspects of it, again, just kind of rhapsodically compelling. And then other people who have no patience for it at all. And one of, I think, the interesting issues is, of course, the sequence of the film and the way in which the editing is done. Maybe that I can't remember the number, but something like 5 different film editors worked with Malick on the film. It's famous for this. Mm-hmm. There are people who find it disjointed and jumbled. And I read in preparing for this, someone said, this is finally the first time that Malick made a film that's the evidence that he's not a complete freak for getting all the details right. Mm-hmm. Well, I don't see that at all. I actually think that in the visuals, it shows every perfectionist impulse he's ever had. But what I want to turn around and ask the group, he begins the film, of course, with a portion of the family narrative, right? We see, among other things, a young girl looking out a barn window who, later is kind of suggested is probably Mrs. O'Brien as a girl. We see a sequence in which it's clear that Mr. and Mrs. O'Brien, I don't think we ever learn their first names, lose a child, right? There's the clear, suggestion that the Western Union man comes and delivers a telegram, and they receive, or she receives through the telegram, tragic news. And there's a moment where, we're getting this voiceover narration in her voice, suggesting that in her early life she was indoctrinated into the sort of Catholic faith with this duality between the state of nature and the state of grace. And there are people who are sort of annoyed by the idea that the dichotomy that the film seems to set up at the very beginning is then undermined through the rest of the film. I don't think that's accidental at all. I think the rest of the film is an exploration of whether the dichotomy of the state of nature and the state of grace is false. That in fact, a state of grace can be found in nature, which I think is almost kind of undeniable. But in other words, I think there's a purpose, of course, to his madness, right? The beginning with the family narrative and then moving to the origins of the cosmos, and then, through the development of life on planet Earth, and then back to the story of the O'Brien family. I'd be curious how others kind of respond to that narrative choice of giving us a film in that sequence, rather than, for instance, beginning with the Big Bang. That would be a very different film, would it not?
Yes.
I kind of want to, Rob, continue.
No, go, please.
I wanted to talk about what you commented about the Cosmos scene and how long it was. And I wanted to just say this before I forgot, but I think for me, like when discussing it with, friends that also like have seen it and enjoyed it, I think that sequence, how strikingly long it is, it just puts even more so into perspective. I think James mentioned earlier how the film, when focused on the family, focuses on such like mundane aspects of life, but just, frames it beautifully that like you have no choice but to be interested. But I think that further, and with how long the Cosmos scene is, just further drives just how little we've been around, like in the grand scheme of everything. And it kind of just compares the comparison between this small family in Texas compared to the origins of our being. I think that, that's part of the dichotomy of the film. And just if it wasn't as long, people would simply dismiss it as, the Big Bang, of course, dinosaurs, of course.
Yeah. I could definitely see that take on that, where if it was shorter. But I guess as a viewer who completely, like Malik threw me off. I mean, like I was in the family and then I was in the Cosmos, and again, it was all fine. I guess that's what, like I couldn't leave. I had to know what was coming. He definitely kept me engaged until the very last moment.
So I think one of the intriguing things, again,
Jeffrey,
about... Yep, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Jeffrey looked like he was going to speak.
It's okay.
Sorry.
No, please, go for it.
Well, my feeling that whole sequence is, yeah, it's indulgent at like 15 plus minutes, but it's beautiful. So you can take that on a whole bunch of levels. But for me, what I was taking it as was sort of, okay, there's first get past the 2001 analogy and then take it for what it is, because it's a little more detailed than that, in that it goes into a lot of stuff, which I'm thinking as I'm watching it, is this actual film of the processes that are going on in life? How much is the CGI aspect? How much is just sort of indulgent? But then going from there, you start to get a feeling after a long period of time where you're like, become more insignificant as you take in more and more of it. And then you have to think also, earlier what happened was, this feeling of loss and this feeling of like, what did these people experience? What was their background? And you have to be very patient with the film, because the first viewing, you won't know what's coming. You won't know how this matters to people when you start to see the family drama part later on. But in the second viewing, when you already know that and you watch that thing, it's a very different experience. So for me, I had to be very patient and be like, you know, enjoy the beauty of this and try to have some moments where you think into, you know, what does this mean to how the people who are clearly religious right from the get-go, you know, is this something about them? So there's all these things I felt like I'm able to get through that because A, beautiful, B, OLED screen, C, AV receiver with, you know, a really nice setup for home theater. So you can now experience really nice film at home. That's, you know, I still pay the garden. I still go to the garden. I walk right around the corner and that's still going on. But it's nice to be able to have that experience at home too. So touching on a number of things we've talked about, I had no trouble really getting through that, even though as I'm watching it, I'm like thinking, my significant other is probably going to struggle with this much of this kind of, whoa, this is pretty visual and crazy. But I think without a doubt,
as they
you can't
say,
look at
there's definitely method in his madness. And I think you're completely right that this is one of the ways experiencing it a second time invites us to read the film very differently, because we vaguely at least remember, right, that there's this family sequence and then there's the cosmos and then the dinosaurs come in, which is definitely something I want to talk about, but we'll come back to that. And then we come back to this rather long sequence with the family that begins in this extraordinarily, you know, balletic kind of way. And then it shifts very significantly over the course of that. You know, obviously the family sequence occupies the bulk of the film. You know, we all sort of talk about how long the cosmos sequence is, but it's not the bulk of the film. It's just a kind of a, I don't want to say just, but it's a rather long interlude, if you will. But when we've seen it once and we come back to it, and it arises, as we've said, out of the news of death, and the way that in which the news of death is narrated with Malick's, you know, kind of classic love for somewhat inscrutable voiceover, which, as you said earlier, Chris, sometimes it is, I think, intentionally inscrutable. I think you cheated a little bit by having the subtitles on the screen, but I would be tempted to do that too. You know, there's a moment in that first family sequence where you know, we're beginning already to get a sense of the fact that the film is much about two worldviews, right? It's grace and nature, and that to some degree, mother and father emblematize those two ways of living. And then, of course, we discover later how much that's actually true, and that maybe it's also not as simple as that. You know, there's a moment where the mother is kind of giving voice to her spirituality, and she says, or we hear her voice saying in voiceover narration, you know, so I can't remember the exact language, but it's something to the effect, I will never forsake you, no matter what comes. And then what comes
the telegram
is the man delivering the telegram, and death comes. And I want to come back to that a little bit later too, but, you know, or maybe we can tackle it here. You know, the two of them are seen responding to death very differently.
Yeah, there's the pool death, which is, you know, also set to music in a separate way and brings back the same theme from the earlier death. But I think the part there when the telegram comes, you start to, you know, see more of the personalities break out. I have some more thoughts on this in a bit, but.
Well, one in particular, and I want to ask, and maybe it's an opportunity for someone else. So the telegram comes, and then father receives the news over the telephone, possibly from the mother. And then, as I say, we see them, you know, it kind of in their neighborhood again, doing things that we, in the middle portion of the film, we kind of see them doing versions of at a younger age, walking around the neighborhood as the camera kind of moves all the time. I'd be curious to hear from anyone else. How do you compare the responses of mother and father to the news of death?
Well, this is what I was going to get to, is the issue with the mom first is saying, I'm good with anything, and then right away goes to questioning it. So you set up that whole thing, and then the later sermon by the priest who's talking about that very aspect of, you need to know that doesn't all work out fine. And this brings up a breaking point where I think about the people who would watch this as religious people or secularists, and how they would interpret, how would they feel about this? Because for a secularist who thinks like, well, death is probabilistic or something, and everyone's going to die. Well, some people die young, some die, you don't need an explanation. It's just, not everyone dies at average life expectancy of 74. Some die way earlier.
Does anybody, I mean, I'm drilling in on this, do you remember I think something really telling that Brad Pitt does in this early sequence after they've learned of the death of their middle son? Anybody, it's not something I even picked up on the first time I watched it, but now I can't escape it. There's a very powerful sequence when they're standing outside, and there's a neighbor, their neighbors on the lawn who come to pay their respects, and he's basically telling them to go away. We're fine. We're fine. We're just fine here. Does anybody know or notice what's he actually doing in that sequence other than telling people to go away? You notice what he's doing with his hands?
He's got a hose.
Yeah, I thought he was either raking or hosing. He was definitely doing yard work.
He's got a kinked hose.
He has a garden hose in his hand, but he's yes, the water is running, but it's not flowing out. So there's sort of a suggestion that he's maybe kinked the hose, or he's bent it on itself so the water isn't coming out of the hose at this particular moment, which seems to me completely emblematic of what we later discover about him, right? That he's a man, who bottles himself up in all sorts of ways, and it comes out periodically, not necessarily always very successfully. So he in a way is done to himself what he does in that particular moment to the garden hose, compared to what mother is doing, where in voiceover we hear her say that despite her faith, right, this statement we've already heard about the importance of living in a state of grace, we hear her saying in a voiceover that she wants to die because she wants to be with her dead son. And of course their respective theologies, I think, come out much more fully later in the film, but I think it's, again, there's a power to this in the cut that then happens when we go to the creation of the cosmos that for me is in a sense a kind of possibly, I only posit this as a theory, of a projection of either their inner states or possibly the inner state of their eldest son, Jack, much of, whose voice or whose point of view informs much of the film. So one of the questions I want to ask both about the Cosmos sequence and, the dinosaur sequence is, how do you read them? Do you read them as Terrence Malick's narration? Do you read them as being kind of seen through the remembered eyes of a child? There's a very tantalizing moment where we see Jack later, absorbed in the age of Sputnik, right, in books illustrated for children, right, that give you a certain view of science for a kid. And I wonder, especially on reviewing this, whether the cosmos and the dinosaur sequences aren't a little bit, again, a kind of an invocation of a child's way of understanding those phenomena. I'd be curious if anyone else reads it that way, or do you read it as Terrence Malick giving you the creation of the universe?
I would say I'm not sure how I read it, although coming from this discussion, can I ask one quick question? How many of us who are on this call have actually seen this more than once? Okay. I definitely need to see this again.
You do.
And there's no doubt. And it's funny because when it ended, and I'm sorry I'm not answering your question directly, James, but I just feel like there, even because as I'm sitting here and listening to you talk about it, I'm also thinking now about the whole Sean Penn character, which we haven't even mentioned yet. I mean, we mentioned Jack, but not like his whole, it was a very fascinating film. And like I said, cinematography and just, with Jack kind of running through what seemed to, it could have been the moon in a lot of these, but thinking about the dinosaurs, that part definitely made me realize during that, because the Cosmos stuff for me was very, like I said, very Nat Geo kind of thing. And I felt like I switched channels for a minute, but then there were other aspects to that like you were saying with the dinosaurs, I really started to feel like, okay, I got to really backtrack and see what I'm missing.
So I'm not going to go to full screen mode here.
Scene 9, right there.
What do you
That's
see?
what I wanted to comment on, was the dinosaur, when the dinosaur comes up and is walking up to the one that's either resting, is injured, hard to tell the first time you watch it, second time you're like, I don't really know what's going on here, steps on it, then is looking away. It's kind of like, there's a kind of motherly protective aspect there, but then you start to go, oh wait, this is the same river you see hundreds and thousands of years later. So it's like a process that's like recurring over time with different creatures.
So we come to the dinosaurs after making our way through the Cosmos sequence. And again, and some of you may know, this is probably the most debated sequence in the entire film, right? It's this dinosaur sequence, right? Where, as you've just said, the one dinosaur comes up and puts his foot on the face of another dinosaur who's lying immobile on the ground but breathing, right? We can see that. I'll just tell you, that the most frequent or the most commonplace read of this is that the sequence is perhaps Malick's visual representation of what was called the birth of compassion. It is obviously subject to being read very differently, right? I mean, I really paid attention to this the other night when I was watching it again to see whether there are visual cues in this, in terms of, how this, I think it's only 4 shots that actually tell us about this idea that again is either perhaps the birth of compassion or the birth of consciousness. But I wanted to share with you, here's another image of that sequence after the kind of moment of conflict, if it is that, is past, is I came across a passage from a 2007 draft of Terrence Malick's screenplay. This was the film that spent more time in gestation than any other Terrence Malick film. In this draft screenplay, there's this passage, quote, "Reptiles emerge from the amphibians and dinosaurs in turn from the reptiles. Among the dinosaurs, we discover the first signs of maternal love as the creatures learn to care for each other. Is not love too a work of the creation? What should we have been without it? How had things been then? Silent as a shadow, consciousness has slipped into the world," end quote. So that's from the 2007 draft of the screenplay. Now, that's not to say, obviously, by the time, the film goes through this massive editing and is released, that it still is Malick's intention, to convey that. But I think, it sort of does seem to underscore one way of reading the scene over another. And if we read the scene in this way, what does this do to the debate about nature and grace? Any theologians on this call, or anyone who kind of,
Ooh.
or who is raised in the faith, so to speak, who
Raised
can
in the
speak
faith,
to
not
the
of the
idea
world.
of grace? And I'll unshare.
Well, I think that well, like, I mean, I hadn't read. I have a version of the script. I'm not sure which version of it is, but I mean, I think it does kind of, that passage does, I feel, kind of point to the idea that, this is like, at this point in the scene, the dinosaur makes a conscious decision not to do what it was born to do, and I think that, looking forward, you can kind of see Jack as a kid, making those same decisions. He feels that he's like his father and supposed to lash out, like, before he even understands that he's more like his father than he thinks. Like shooting his brother in the finger with a BB gun. That's something that I think he chose to do consciously, but he can't even explain it. And I think if we could go into this dinosaur's thoughts, he or she might not understand why they let this dinosaur, who I think is playing dead, go. But, and as it walks away, it's probably just on to do it to actually go kill or eat something. I feel that this was just kind of like an anomaly in its programming.
But I think you make a really acute point that if there's a parallel, and I do think, that even in the Cosmos sequences, there are parallels, however kind of narrational they sometimes are, with what happens in the kind of long center, sequence, if you will, from, the birth to the, the kind of growth out of innocence of the children. That sequence, when for a while Jack kind of plays with the idea of the dark side, right? Of either being just a bad kid or maybe even being tempted by evil. I don't think it's, such a stretch, given that we're talking about Terrence Malick here, to think that when we see that sequence, the breaking of the windows, shooting his brother, after we've earlier seen that a relationship of trust still existed between the brothers, that relationship of trust is then breached when he actually shoots him with the BB gun, despite having said that he wasn't going to do it. It seems to sort of be true that Jack steps back from the precipice, just as in a way the dinosaur does.
Well, he stepped back because eventually the other brother takes on the role of Grace and forgives him and re-expresses his love. And there's a question of whether Jack will ultimately come back into the fold, and that leads into who he became way later in life, 40 to 60 years later, depending on whether that's
when that is.
It's irrelevant for the most part, but
other than his Armani wardrobe.
Right, And some giveaways to LCD screens are like 2000, and then it's a little screwy.
I mean, part of what I'm interested in about the dinosaur sequence, that if again we get hints from this earlier draft of the screenplay, and then some of what happens later in the film, and it is the kind of idea of the introduction of consciousness. Someone more traditionally raised in a kind of Catholic theology than I might have problems with the idea that dinosaurs could exist in a state of grace, right? By definition, it was only humans that could aspire to a state of grace. And to my mind, this is one of the reasons why I think the whole film is a kind of complication of the idea that nature sits over here and grace sits over here, but rather we see them interweaving all the time, and that's not some accident of Terrence Malick's filmmaking, but maybe one of the fundamental themes of the film. That these dichotomies are commingled in the dinosaur world, just as later in the world of children living in Texas in the 1950s.
Yeah, but right from the get-go, the mother says that essentially nature and grace is a choice when she's a child, and man has to make that choice. and a lot of the film is the development of that. And then, and as David had said, whether it's a conscious choice sometimes,
Right.
or whether it's not a conscious choice, like, hard to know. And it's dependent upon what influences are going on in the people who
Yeah.
are around them choosing nature or grace. Because when he's in a pack of wild kids, they're all choosing nature. And then there's a moment every once in a while when a kid will look away and be like, maybe I should not be doing this. So there's this tension between what is the right way to be, and for a lot of people, I think if you've lived through a lot of these things already, you know, like, how you experience those tensions. So you'll put your own kind of personal history onto it.
So would folks on this call agree that in a way this tension is substantially played out through the film, in the characters of mother and father?
Yes.
Well, they were definitely
I felt like there was
nature
tension.
grace.
I felt like there was tension the whole film. Well, just
And I think we could also probably pretty quickly agree it's not as simplistic as right, a clear duality, right? Because the mother has her kind of catechism, if you will, but that quickly, as we've said early, even before the Cosmos sequence, is complicated by the fact that it's not as clear cut as I think in the sense the catechism that she was probably taught as a child. And I have to say, I think Jessica Chastain as mother is a kind of I think they're both rather marvelous performances. But I wanted to bring up, if I could, a couple of images here that kind of maybe speak to the kind of issues of both mother and father. Someone else was going to speak.
Yeah, really quick, I would like to say that I feel that the way that Mr. O'Brien, Brad Pitt's character, the way that he tries to enforce the way of nature onto Jack is almost as if he's been betrayed by the way of grace in the past. And like, that's obviously something we don't see, so that's just an assumption. But just like his insistence to help steer Jack in that direction is almost, as the oldest son, is just like, don't be a fool to grace when there's a world full of nature out there. You know what I mean?
Well, it's interesting, I think, that the father, Mr. O'Brien, seems to be the one who's more interested in the kind of the traditions or the rituals of the church, right? It seems to be he who's kind of indoctrinating the boys in that behavior, but his catechism is kind of all over the map. I mean, one moment, for example, he says to his son, well, you're waiting for something to happen. That's it. That's life. You lived it. That's his moral philosophy. Actually, we should probably look at him on the screen instead of Jessica Chastain. Because I think, the father character in Brad Pitt, it's so interesting how he's treated filmically, how he's often kind of seen visually, compared to how Jessica Chastain is shown. I mean, they're both, of course, shown in extraordinary light. I personally think one of the reasons I can keep going back to this film, I am obviously trained as an art historian, is simply how extraordinary these images are, how often they're backlit, how often they're lit only by natural light, how often we're seeing the constant, the gently in motion use of the handheld camera. But I do think even in, obviously I'm playing with us, but these pairs of images suggest something fundamentally very different about mother and father, and even I think in both of their cases, mother and father at different moments of their lives. I think, for example, in the case of mother, there's a really fundamental shift. Her wardrobe changes. Her wardrobe goes from light to dark. She goes from being someone who's, even in the color palette of the clothes she wears, she's kind of related to the sky. Then she suddenly becomes of the earth. She's grounded. And that some of that shift happens around, the knowledge of the death of her son.
Yeah.
You know, one of the, I think the further complexities here is, you know, at one moment, Jack says, you know, that he's kind of putting his father and God in the same bucket, you know, merging kind of earthly and divine. He says at one point, why should I be good if you aren't? And of course, I think one of the complexities of the voiceover narration is sometimes we don't know who's speaking to whom. Is the speaker speaking to a human in memory? Or is the speaker speaking to God, either in frustration or fear or angst or, you know, whatever the emotions of the time may be? But again, you know, Mr. O'Brien's theology, another moment, he says to his boys, you can't be too good. The wrong people in his world go hungry or die or get loved. Mother, I think, wants to believe that goodness comes to good people, people who live in a state of grace. And then, of course, she discovers rather dramatically that that's probably false when she loses a child.
Yeah, she's saying in the end, nothing bad comes to them, but they're going to suffer hellaciously along the way. The dad said has sort of a cynical approach where, you know, you can do all the right things, work really hard, but the ones who kind of cut the corners and cheat a bit are going to be the ones who get ahead. The one who network might be the one who gets ahead. But I think his son sees him ultimately as a hypocrite. And that's sort of an analogy on the way some kids see the Catholic Church as they grow up, indoctrinated in it, and they resist it when they start to see that the world doesn't conform to sort of the things that they're told of the way things should be. But I found that Jack's young child evolution, you know, extremely troubling, because he goes all the way down the path to thinking maybe I'll just tip this car jack over and that'll be that. So it gets quite dark watching how far one might go down that path if they reject everything that has to do with grace and not understand that their dad's a complicated character and has maybe good intentions, but isn't even able to express the things he expresses after the son's death, when he like starts to talk about how, you know, he never said he was sorry, how he felt bad when he brought his shame upon his son by smacking him, you know, as he turned the pages wrong for, you know, playing the piano. I mean, it's a very, very militaristic sort of dad thing. And if you've grown up with any of that aspect, you're like, oh boy, yeah, you can see how.
So let me add, there's a couple of different reasons why I chose this particular still image from the film. One is because I think it tells us something, you know, if we understand that this is some of the language of how Jessica Chastain as mother holds her children, and we see her do versions of this and be playful with them in ways we never, you know, see father being. It's also super interesting to me because of this over here, right? The young Jack who grows up to be Sean Penn in a somewhat complicated way, you know, there's something really interesting about young Jack, you know, that he's often clearly eyeing his parents with judgment, both of them. Yeah. You know, at one point, of course, he speaks so strongly against his incredibly loving, even slightly childlike mother, who is silent, you know, on screen other than in voiceover through at least like the first 2/3 of the film. She never actually utters a word other than in voiceover. And then she begins to speak a little bit. But, you know, Jack judges her, you know, why should I listen to you? You let him do this to you and to us. But he doesn't just stand, of course, you know, see, he isn't just standing in judgment of his father. He's standing in judgment of his mother. But last night, for example, when I was watching this, I was struck by how often this is the way he, you know, he holds his son. Yeah. It's both a kind of gesture of endearment, and yet it's very, sorry?
There's a lot of fear from the kids from the domination aspect from the
That's
the
right.
dad.
It's very dominating. And so, you know, I think one of the things that's so interesting about Brad Pitt's character is it's just not straightforward. You know, it would be very easy to demonize this guy, and yet, you know, he's actually surprisingly affectionate with his children. I don't happen to think this is enormously affectionate, although maybe. But, you know, the other moments where he sort of demands that his boys kiss him, which is sort of interesting, right? That he has to prize that affection out of them.
But even when at dinner, when his son called him dad, and he says, "Don't call me dad, you call me what, father?"
Sir.
Well, sir.
Yeah.
Right, sir. Yeah. Which I thought was, kind of military, in a weird way, just that, like you were saying, kind of,
Well, he's somewhat of a cliched 50s dad.
yeah.
There's a lot of traditionalism that you forget about because we don't live in this time. But a lot of the stuff that, people I know now that we've talked about this as adults, these were the parents they grew up with in some ways. The mom didn't work. The mom was, subjected to the whims of the dad and whatever, type of father that might have existed. So you start to learn about this only later when your friends might start to talk about how they actually grew up as opposed to what you saw them growing up as.
Right. And I think, when I hear you use the term, he's a 50s cliche dad, I don't mean to get excessively autobiographical here, but I had that dad. That was my cliche dad. So I think there are probably reasons why this element of the film resonates with me, because I understand aspects of that dynamic. I realize we're probably kind of getting to the limit of everyone's patience for having this discussion, but I wanted to put up this image in part because it's one that I still have no answer to myself. I would simply love to hear anyone. I have a theory, but again, I'd rather hear others first. And if anyone who's been on the call who hasn't really spoken would like to offer up, what do you think this is about? This kind of fascinating sequence where suddenly mother kind of dances in the air. Can we give a minute for someone maybe who hasn't spoken first?
Yeah, go for it.
Anybody? No, if we've intimidated you. So yeah,
I haven't been able to get past the crouching tiger, hidden dragon stuff. No matter how many times I see it, that's the first thing that hits me. And then I'm like, I can't actually dig deeper.
Well, I have a theory, which I'll put forward, and that is, again, I think this is one of the moments that invite us to sort of maybe see this whole middle sequence of the film as being a memory of childhood, episodic, slightly random, certainly non-linear, as seen through the eyes of the adult Jack, as seen through Sean Penn's memory, which is obviously, false and skewed and probably true, all at the same time. And like you, initially I was it took me out of the reality of the film because it made me so conscious of the artifice of it. But in rewatching it again, I think there obviously is something very intentional. And I think it raises even the question, does Jack remember her as a kind of an angel who could literally dance in the air? And is she seen this way perhaps because by the time he's the adult Sean Penn and he's looking back, maybe she's no longer living? We have some evidence in the later sequences of the film that Sean Penn, still has his father, because they have an unfortunate conversation and seemingly Jack says something about his dead brother that he then regrets. But again, all of this is a little bit, opaque, certainly not easy to decipher. But again, I think this is one of those moments in the film where maybe, Terrence Malick is signaling something about his intentions of how we might kind of read the narration of this, because it otherwise simply doesn't make any form of literal sense. It is obviously not the only moment in the film where there's a kind of magic realism that comes into play. But it's maybe the most striking departure during the kind of familial sequences or narrative of the film.
Well, James, you were, I believe you mentioned the wardrobe and just how when her clothes becomes darker, she's grounded. I think that this, and this is just something I'm thinking of now, not that I thought of while viewing, but just I think it could possibly kind of represent her faith and just her complete faith in the, in religion and, the divine. But then that ability almost gets taken away you know, when after the death of the middle son. But also, I think it's in my simplest thought, it's just a reminder that not everything you're seeing could be exactly as it played out. Because I think it's very easy while you're watching it with how it's paced and how it's edited that, you know, you're going from, you know, Sean Penn's, you know, current life and then back in time, and some things feel very real, and then, you know, the cosmos and just like everything is kind of like it's not as it's simply just I feel like it's a reminder that, you know, these people they're more than just a family in a, you know,
Absolutely.
in
I
Texas.
mean, I think, you know, I think it's a mistake, and some critics make this mistake, to read the whole family sequence of the film as if it has nothing to do with the cosmos. You know, just to remind you, of course, there's that moment in the film that begins one of these particularly kind of rhapsodic, music-driven, you know, sequences when Jessica Chastain, holding her son, points up to the sky and says something like, "God lives up there. That's where God lives." But leaving, you know, that literalism to the side, you know, filmically, it's so interesting that through much of the film, sky is a really important, it's almost a character in the film. The way in which the camera is sometimes very low to the ground and looks up, and we see characters like here, you know, silhouetted against the sky. I think it's a way of kind of suggesting that somehow, you know, we're never far removed from the cosmos. It's there, it's with us, and we're a part of it. You know, many of the moments, I showed you one earlier in which we see the you know, the trees are seen, you know, looking up toward the sky in a way that could be, I'm sure, you know, understood in a somewhat, you know, spiritual character.
I also looked at the trees as like, these last hundreds of years grow closer to the sky, never get there. We don't come anywhere close, and have no understanding or some little understanding of.
And this to me is one of the real linkages with his previous film, which is the New World, in that, you know, these kinds of images of the forest appear so heavily in that film too. And I think both of them try to get at this idea of, you know, what is our human relationship to nature and to the cosmos, which is something that he gets at more, you know, more definitively, if open-endedly, in this film. The last thing maybe I want to leave you with, you know, without getting into the, you know, what do we make of the Sean Penn, you know, story, and, you know, elements we see glimpsed earlier in the film but with which the film ends. You know, whether it's mother walking in this kind of desert scape, or, you know, in a more maybe foreboding way. I mean, it's fascinating to me that, you know, here's mother walking across something that's navigable. When Sean Penn goes into the desert, if you don't mind the analogy, you know, he has to try to navigate this kind of landscape. You know, I saw this and I thought, oh, that's going to do a number on his Armani suit and shoes. But I think, again, for me at least, part of this begs the question of whether the whole film is in a certain way a kind of an investigation in the loss of, you know, a biblical Eden, of the loss of innocence, you know, of these children who go from innocence into knowledge.
And we're never given how the brother died. We only know we only know he died. I believe I remember hearing that he was 17 years old.
19.
Yeah.
The film says very explicitly that he was 19.
19.
You know, the reason I think we can intuit that it's the middle brother is partly because the guitar. That's exactly right. When we go into what is obviously meant to be the bedroom of the deceased kid, we see the guitar and we see the camera lingers over the paintbrushes. Mm-hmm. So it's the middle boy, whose name I forget, but, you know, who's clearly the more artistic, you know, the more maybe spiritual in the sense of the brothers, compared certainly to Jack, the eldest. And the youngest doesn't really seem to have a personality yet, maybe because he's too young. He hasn't kind of developed his complexity yet.
Yeah, the actual death of the brother is linked to Terrence's brother's dying. His brother was a guitar student of Segovia, and one of the last pieces in the credits is Fernando Soares' Opus 35, which I play on guitar, which is really weird to hear at the end of the movie because I learned that in beginner intermediate classical guitar. And Segovia plays that piece at the end, and his brother died in Spain as a student of Segovia. So there's
that's so
a
interesting.
fair amount of autobiographical stuff going on there that you wouldn't necessarily know. I only knew it because I heard the song and I thought, why is this song in here? Because that's part of Stowe's 20 studies for intermediate guitar. It's a very strange thing.
I have to say, a part of Malik's biography that I didn't know. I mean, in part because of the timing of the film, that they're children of the 50s. I think the death of the middle boy could mean many different things. It was tempting to think perhaps, because the death is announced via telegram, is it war related? It's, I think it's like so much of the film, it's intentionally kind of open-ended.
Inscrutable, yeah.
And yeah, inscrutable is a great word. Much of the film is.
There was a point where, for me, when obviously the friend's child died in the pool, and I mean, I had to take a moment and just say, okay, wait, who just died? Was it Jack's brother that died in the pool? But they weren't racing. I mean, and yet Dad O'Brien ran over to help the boy actually and get everybody, and you go get help over there. And so, like, I wasn't sure if that was his son, their child at the moment. And then I realized that it was obviously definitely not. But I was also, I guess you can definitely tell from Jack's, like Sean Penn's, he was definitely struggling the whole movie. And I think part of it was also what I took was, how I think he tried to be closer with his dad. And, there were times where his father was just so, militant with him, and when they were planting and digging the hole, like working in the yard to put up the divide between the houses, and and he was trying to teach him as the oldest child, he was making him work the hardest or take the most responsibility, but yet maybe like that picture you had showed before with Jack looking at his mom hugging the brother or embracing the brother might be, to me, I kind of took that as maybe, well, he was feeling like he didn't have that, they
touch on that. It was right at the start when the new brother is born, and they show first that he's playing with his toys and having so much fun, and he takes the same toys when the second son is born and just kicks them and throws them away, and is like, I'm rejecting this because I'm not getting what I think I deserve in some way. And then the question is, who does he become after that sort of feeling starts to take on? And so there's this whole aspect of his development. So for child psychologists, there's a lot to watch in this movie.
It's also, I think, really tempting, because of how we see Sean Penn. He has some of the trappings of earthly success, right? He has nice clothes. He lives in a kind of more than slightly glamorized version of his parents' second house. That he has somehow learned from, his father, and absorbed these messages that, you have to work really, really hard, and success doesn't come to kind people. That maybe, he's gone down that path, but not in a way that is certainly suggestive that he's ever found happiness or contentment. Whoever the female companion is, again, there's, the intimations are that perhaps that he struggles with depression or intimacy, or again, it's all very open-ended. It's only suggested visually. There's no narrative really at all to tell us much about the man he's become.
Yeah, because even in his office environment, the big, modern kind of futuristic skyscraper, at first I felt like I was on Park Avenue and 41st Street in New York. And then I felt like I was in a different place completely. Like they moved the locations of where he was and when he left that office building and just started walking, like I felt like, is this something that just, has this been going on in his life for 40 years? Like, he's finally walking out? Like when he got, because I did feel like he did become some type of success based on how he grew up, but he didn't care about it. He didn't care about it because he literally got up and he just walked out on it, you know.
Maybe I'll leave us on this note. I think having surveyed some of the critical literature of the film, I do think it's probably true that if there's critical consensus about one thing, it's that the contemporary section, with the adult Sean Penn, is the least successful. And for many critics, the most, aggravating, even in, the kind of radiant conclusion. I think a lot of people find it, myself included, not wholly convincing. But I'll leave you with this thought. This comes from the critic Olivier Père, who was part of a really interesting panel discussion about this film, that he embraces the cosmic sequence and the familial sequence at the center of the film as, again, verging on the sublime. And I'll quote him here. He says, "They raise the possibility, perhaps never seen before, of an infinitesimal cinema, i.e., rather than choosing between the grandiose and the intimate, the cosmic and the familial, philosophy and poetry, he combines them in the same film, not in layers, but in successive chunks that create a dialogue, talking and responding to one another." And for me, that's a pretty satisfying kind of characterization about the film. So Chris, shall we wrap up here?
Yes, James, I wanted to thank you so much and thank everyone for joining us in this conversation. I think the biggest takeaway of all of this is that
we need a part 2.
Yeah, we need I was going to say, it's been 10 years. It's been 9 years since the movie came out. So we'll rejoin again in another 9 years after we've digested it some more and seen it another couple times.
Yeah, I watched it a few more times.
Yeah. But yes, there's so much in this film, and thank you for taking this time to join us to talk about a bit of it. And I hope that you all get more chance to explore Malick's films and
Badlands.
enjoy his incredible filmography more. Thank you again, James, for leading us through this discussion and for all of your time tonight.
Yeah.
Thank all of you, especially those of you who so verbally engaged with me. That's great fun. So
I tell you, I was after watching it, I was so happy that this was actually happening.
Good.
I needed some clarification.
It is, when I was thinking about this earlier, and as I said, the things, books and films that I enjoy revisiting because I find different things in them, my relationship to this film is utterly other than, let's say, my relationship with Singing in the Rain or Casablanca, which I simply enjoy every time.
Right.
But I don't necessarily find new layers and complexities in them, which is, again, one reason to keep looking back at cinema. So. Yeah. Great fun tonight. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
The big question is, when are we coming back to the Garden Cinema?
Oh, yeah.
Hopefully late next year.
Yeah, probably 2021.
I look forward to it.
Yeah, we'll see you all then.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.